Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight, and thank you, everyone on the panel, for being here. I'm just going to tell a little sort of a personal story to begin, at the risk of being a personal story. but I wanted to just talk a little bit more about the moment when Sid asked me to do this last year. And you know, she came into the gallery and, as she said, kind of trapped me, and I said yes, because I have a problem with that. And but I began to think about it too much, which is something that I do. I just created an entire, nest of an ecosystem right away. And I thought, but why me? Like, what do I have to offer here? I'm not a historian. I have a very particular experience of dealing with artists at the gallery. It's a strong set of habits and a really strong filter that I enjoy a lot. But I began to wonder, and I was really quite confused and overwhelmed right away. And I thought, well, boy, if we're going to do this, I'd really like it to be good. I'd like it to be interesting. So I'm going to really set the bar, quite high, as you can see I have, and I'm really out of my depth up here already. But in the middle of all that kind of morass of confusion, I had a memory. And it was something I really hadn't, if I have had this memory before, it hadn't been for many, many, many years. And it was a memory about my mother, who was a musician for her entire life. When I was very young, she sang the folk songs of the day to me, Peter, Paul, and Mary, and Ian and Sylvia, and these wonderful songs about travel and wanderlust and wanting to be in other places and just being sort of dislocated in your own location, and it was wonderful. And then she became interested in classical music and began to study in universities in Boston. And the memory is of her first public recital. And the story is about space. What I'm trying to do is set the tone about this space and these people that are in it. We're all in it together. And this was this first public recital that she did in a public library in Cranston, Rhode Island. And it was after she had studied classical music for a little bit, and her revered and very important professor was in the room with her, watching her perform. And I was sitting there. I was, as I said, quite young, and I think I didn't see the world any differently than the way my mother felt and saw the world at that time. I don't know that I was even 10 years old, So this was this deeply personal experience for me that I didn't even recognize as something personal yet. Right, but suddenly it was also public, and it had dimension. And so she played this recital, and her professor appeared to me to have fallen asleep. And he was, had his eyes closed, and later I said, Mom, Professor Norton was sleeping during your performance. And she said, no, he was listening very deeply. He was really intently listening. And what happened in that moment as a very young person in my life is that something opened up for me. A space opened up in my life. It was intimate and personal, private, public-facing. It included immersive listening, looking, observing and absorbing. And also, the first thing I thought when she said that he was sleeping was that it was a lie, that wasn't true. So also what became part of that space was reality and the way it's discussed and talked about and presented and rendered, and ideas about imposterism being a real experience. And so for me, what happened in my life was that turned from a looking space into a looking space, from a listening space into a looking space. And I have quite happily been engaged in trying to find moments where language opens up space and looking occurs and possibilities happen after that. And I believe that this is a room where that can happen tonight. I'm very, very grateful that these people are here with me. We're sort of half planned and half unplanned for this, which is what we didn't want to really kill the animal, so we're just going to kind of see what happens here. But what I want to do is just briefly continue, if it's okay, continue a little bit with the personal note about who these people are. So after I said yes, I began to do what I do, which is just sort of pay attention, to things like what can happen here, who's around, what's lighting up the horizon, right? And one of the first people I thought of was Leah. at the end of the table, and Leah is currently the Director of Exhibitions and Contemporary Curatorial Initiatives at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. She had a curatorial career as a writer, a curator, and an educator in Boston for several years before that, 13 years before that. And I know her as someone who works in new spaces. I know her as someone who curates work in a way that's not antithetical to painting, but is saying something different than happens in painting spaces. And I really admire the space and the motion and the action around what she gets done. But the reason I asked her is because 12 years ago she came to Provincetown and interviewed me for a publication she was writing for called Big Red and Shiny, and it was about the Boston School. She was researching the Boston School, and I was part of the Boston School and knew those people. We made art together, we did all kinds of things together, but I also, that was a period of my life in Boston where I was sort of self-destructive, and I had sort of set it aside and pushed it away to come to Provincetown. What happened at the end of that interview was that she got a good piece of information. She wrote a nice article about it, but I had a story. She created a space with language that allowed me to exist and flourish and to feel that I had participated in my own life in a very new way. It was a tremendous gift to me. I've never forgotten it. And I thought, Leah, yes. Similarly, I met Fred, who's the chair of the printmaking department at Mass College of Art, when I was lucky enough to be invited there to do student reviews, and I watched him with the students. Now, Fred, it's reductive to talk about his teaching because he does so many other things. It's not that it's not important, but there's a lot of other things he does. There's a wonderful piece of his up at the Schoolhouse right now, for example, but I watched him do a similar thing with language and space with students there, where he would just create this really palpable experience of good ground. And these kids would be standing around the good ground with him, and he would use the language of association and suggestion to ask them to step into the center of their own space. And every time they would begin to talk about their own work with agency and authority and enthusiasm and curiosity. And it was amazing. It was just something, so I thought, yes, Fred. And then Mira, I am going to read something about because I think that's the best thing to do. So Mira, I've known, sort of peripherally for a long time and admired a great deal. I absolutely love looking at Mira's work when it's on the walls in Provincetown. She's a New York-based artist and writer noted for her advocacy of painting in a post-medium visual culture and for her contributions to feminist art history. Schor's work balances political and theoretical concerns with formalist and material passions. Her work has included major periods in which gendered narrative and representation of the body have been featured. In other periods, the focus of her work has been representation of language in drawing and painting. The central theme in recent paintings is the experience of living in a moment of radical inequality, austerity, and accelerated time, set against the powerful pull of older notions of time, craft, and visual pleasure. My experience of looking at Mira's work is twofold. One is that I have always admired her strong objection to injustice as it appears in her work and her writing. And also, when I see the work itself, it's antithetical to everything that I am moved towards as a peacemaker and a conflict avoider. It's just this very alive, wonderful, enveloping, demanding, beautiful, endless thing. It really, Mira's work, what I think about work like this is that what it is how it exists, and how it exists is what it is. And both of those things are completely generative and really challenging and absolutely gorgeous. And so really excited to have her here. And Helen, we just met in person a minute ago. And so, I'm not even going to attempt to do Helen's resume, but as you know, Helen is a curator and a writer and is well known on podcasts. And I just have to say that what I am about Helen is a total fanboy. That's how I found her. I would listen to she and Steve Locke talk about shows that they had seen. I think it's around Christmas you do this. And that to me was like language porn. I was like, they're talking about things they looked at, like, I never want this to end. And it's just an amazing experience. If you have not had the good fortune to listen to these podcasts, please do, and use it as an entrance into the rest of her thinking and her writing and her career. It's endlessly interesting and really tasty stuff. But the common thread that I'm talking about with language and space is another podcast that I was listening to where she was talking to Sarah Schulman, and they were talking, and it was really interesting and just this great conversation. But what I noticed, it was kind of a muscular experience. It was something that was happening in my body, which was that she was creating space with listening. And also the conversation from Helen was driven with a real joyful curiosity about having the conversation. So there was this thing where there was the whole patriarchal column was flipped on its head. You know, she was using kindness, empathy, listening, curiosity, these things that are relegated away from what we are taught are, you know, sort of oppressive type strengths, to get to this place that, you know, was magical. And then at the end of it, they said, oh, by the way, we're upstairs at WMR. And I thought, what? So that is really the reason for the room from me to you, and I'm really glad you're here with us. And you know what we're going to do is we're just going to really ask the question. You know, I'll try to, you know, we'll have some time at the end for questions from you all, but we're just going to ask the question. And Mira has written something, so she's going to read back as a first response. And you know, so we're here to reconsider the question: what is an artist today? And then we'll hopefully go deeper as we go. Okay.
Should I hold on to this, or is it picking up?
It's good.
It's picking up. Okay, great. All right. Yeah, I apologize for reading, but it just makes it a little easier. So I'm starting in a very contradictory way in relation to the theme of what is an artist, because I'm going to talk about an anecdote from many years ago that was the first thing I thought of when Mike invited me, which was a conversation I had with a friend. I was 27, she was in her early 30s, and it was a conversation about whether or not she was an artist. And basically I said, no, I do not think that you are an artist. I should say that she was a very talented person, and she, not only that, but one that actually influenced many things that I did in the decade that I was closest to knew her the best. One of the things was she knit the beautiful coats of her own design, which I then attempted to copy. She decoratively painted everything in her house. She did many drawings. Everything was beautiful. But I felt that it remained within a sphere that was not the one that I was fighting to be taken seriously in. I'd participated in the Cal Arts Feminist Art Program's Woman House project, where I should say that while we were working on that project, one day the teachers, Miriam Shapiro and Judy Chicago, did this like little workshop. It was mostly Judy's idea, as many things like that were, which was to have us simply learn to introduce ourselves and say, my name is Mira Schor, and I'm a painter. And I was always critical of everything that they were doing, so I was standing there thinking, this is just the stupidest thing I've ever heard. But of course, it's one of the things that really stayed with me the rest of my life, which was that is a basic thing for a woman to learn. Not like, yeah, I make some art in the back room or whatever, but I am an artist, I am a painter, I am a sculptor, whatever it is that you're doing. So I had, when I had this conversation, I had an MFA, and I was teaching at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design in Halifax, where I'd started teaching when I was 24, and I was the only woman on a faculty of 14 artists. So speaking from that framework, I said that she wasn't an artist according to my definition at the time, or my sense of what that meant. That was so mean. So why was I saying that? So again, I was in the middle of the first decade of a lifetime fight to be taken seriously as a functioning artist in the art world, in relation to art history, and in relation to significant art movements that had challenged my own early definitions of what art was. not what being an artist was. My parents were artists. That was the fundamental identity that I understood. I was involved in discourse, and I think that that's what I was trying to get across, that I was involved in a struggle within myself to grow myself and not stay in one place, because that might have become easy for me. But I was also existing in a world of art, a world of history, that I was learning about, that I was responding to, and where I wanted to live and to be taken seriously. I looked at the text of Hans Hofmann's talk, which was published about the last time there was a panel 49, 25 years ago, and I thought I would kind of piggyback on that a little bit. In the text of his statement for the original What is an Artist panel on the first evening of Forum 49, which was July 3rd, 1949, I find many of the echoes of what I was trying to say that day. He said, "Traditions must be kept alive. Traditions must not end in self-contentment." He said that all things came into existence through struggle and fight. All that is alive through constant struggle and fight. He went on to say, well, I don't know what an artist is, but I do know what makes an artist. I do know that only the man, of course it's all the man, equipped with creative instincts and a searching mind is destined to become an artist. He said, talent is everywhere. It does not make the artist. And this accords in a way with what I was saying to my very talented friend when I was 27, which was that it was not enough to just have talent in art, which many people do, or more people than become professional artists or dedicate their life to that practice. Hofmann said that talent is often a handicap because it invites cleverness, which always chooses the easiest path in life. He quoted the French author André Malraux saying that only conscious sensitivity achieves great art. Hofmann said the quality must be conquered. I thought that was interesting. It asks for struggle. It often means despair. It asks for character. He said, a society's vital beliefs will certainly leave its mark on the artist. This mark will be deeply embedded in his art, not in the sense of propaganda, but in the sense of his awareness of his cultural mission. Ideas must be steadily reborn. Unconditional creativeness is its prerequisite. So that's actually an interesting, that last word seems to go back to what my friend was involved with, which was a kind of unconditional creativeness, and yet I was introducing something that also was historical and political into that. And I was shaped within the world which Hofmann dominated as a teacher. There was a battle for identity over whether one was an artist or not, and whether one was doing the right kind of work. And I was actually told to my face at one point by a Provincetown school guy who ran a school in Provincetown that I would never be an artist. This was just before I went to graduate school. And when I came back to him about 15, 20 years later, like, yeah. He was kind of taken aback. And then he took the whole summer. At the end of the summer, he said, I never said that you wouldn't be an artist. I said you wouldn't be a painter. That makes it all better. But that world was a world where the conversations in my family home were about really what art was, like what could be art, or what was supposed to be the right kind of art. And we're talking about New York in the 1940s, well, I was in the 50s, and there was a lot of positioning by abstract expressionists about, what was the hierarchy of art, and they were trying to reset the hierarchy so that European art was feminine and decorative, bad word, and Americans were doing a certain kind of art. So all those kinds of discussions, it positioned me historically and in a discussion about formal issues and about history before I even really fully understood that I was going to be an artist. And it's from that place that I spoke so judgmentally to my friend. So finally, I think that this sense of criticality and maybe some of the reflections on history and so forth are important now, and form are important now precisely because there is so much proficiency in art. There's so many artists around the world doing works in one of a large range of available types and styles of art making available at this time. They do them incredibly well with great consistency, disconcerting consistency, which is important in the art market environment we live in. So then that sense of inner criticality is even more important, that sense of self-criticality and of allowing oneself to be challenged by the antithetical, whether it's content or form. That is what is an artist today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mira. So I think, then I'm already having some sort of natural questions based on the first panel where there was a concern about, the first panel took place after the Second World War, and there was some sort of background concern about how to be an artist and a citizen and the functionality of art and these sorts of things. So maybe not for now, but I wonder, just in response to that, like, is it necessary then to have a question about where an art community or an artist or an ecosystem of studios or practice can be held? Does it need to be held somewhere? Is it associated with other things? So perhaps we will not answer that question now and let other people talk. And either Fred or Leah, do you want to extrapolate? Leah?
Sure. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay, great. I am a low talker, so if you can't hear me, just gesture. Well, that's a tough act and an honor to follow. I want to say that I really appreciate being here in this room with everyone. It's a really full circle for me in a lot of ways. I wrote the article about the Boston School in 2012, and I literally was Googling around the internet looking for people that had been friends with or in the circle of Marc Mauriceau, and Mike is a name that came up from the 11th Hour, from the Marc Mauriceau catalog from like 2009-10, and he was one of two people that answered my weird kind of hello, I'm interested in this subject email, and it was such a meaningful conversation for me too, because that was really the first time I wrote about art and place in a serious way. And it's funny because that was happening kind of at the same time, and was, I want to, in part inspired by Helen Molesworth at the ICA Boston. This will have been art in the 1980s. And I was so struck at that time about how you were kind of putting your own personhood and your personality in that work in the opening, in the credit lines for that catalog, talking about your experience in the 80s and kind of thinking about that time. So it's just really wonderful to be on the same stage. And Mira, your writing is so inspirational to me, thinking about that people could write about art in a serious way beyond being in school. And then it's still full circle too, because Fred is such a pillar of the Boston art community, and I can't tell you the amount of times that I've done studio visits with artists in that, is it West Dedham? Where's that studio? And everyone, I'm like, how do you get this amazing, beautiful studio, Hyde Park, amazing, beautiful studio in Boston? They're like, oh, this mass art professor is like letting me use it. And I'm like, is it Fred? And it is, it always is. So anyway, it's really, I feel like everyone here is so, cares so much about not only the art, but the person, the artist, who is this artist? So anyway, and the people behind it. So I was thinking about this question, and I think I kept coming back to this idea of, to riff on Hannah Arendt, it's someone who's really invested in the life of the mind. It's not someone who is just putting something in the world and gonna walk away and putting something, of their own mind in the world and gonna gonna just let it be. It's someone that wants to have a conversation with the world in some way, someone that wants to externalize what they're thinking in an expressive way. And I kind of, when I first was asked to be a part of this and was looking at some of the material from Hofmann and the whole scene around Forum 49, I was like, well, what was an artist? Because, it's like, that was such a, in my mind, like such a romantic time where, you could come to a place like Provincetown and live for a summer so cheaply and be with your friends and make art and, go back to your teaching job and live in a city with cheap rent. And those kinds of things don't seem possible anymore in so many ways. Those teaching jobs, I work at an institution that did just affect a lot of teachers' jobs. That's the gallery system. It's like that you all have to be a mega gallery or not. It's just really the precarity just seems staggering, and that's to say nothing. That's just to talk about the art world and not to say the world at large. So, but then I was thinking about Hofmann. I was thinking about Helen Frankenthaler. I was thinking about these people that. A lot of instances, they had to come to the U.S. They were immigrants. They had to start their lives again. They had been through huge geopolitical turmoil. They were in a place, in a climate politically that was not hospitable to artists, and then they had to create all of these systems and structures that we think of like as very familiar. So I feel like it's always, that made me come back to my kind of like Pollyanna moment of like, it's someone who is, these artists, they are invested in the life of the mind and they're world building through that investment. They are challenging. There's an act of survival. There is kind of, they're people that are going to externalize or articulate something for a group of people in a community, and they have to do it. That's it right now.
So I just have a question in response to that. So
Yeah.
because I have a question for us in general about whether or not, depending upon what you think an artist is, whether or not there's a moment of decision or moments of decision or a moment of investment or continued investments in this, and what it is that has to be invested in or given up at that time. I think that, one of the things I was thinking about for this discussion was those same people and the ideals that drove them. And I know in talking to some of them briefly in my time in Provincetown, there was a sense that they had left society in general and were working to create a separate society within the broader margins that was designed to initiate change. And I thought, well, that's very different than things now. And then I thought, wait a minute, no, it isn't. It's not different at all. So I'm interested in if you have, Leah, a sort of an idea about what a society of artists is, and is there anything sort of intrinsic, or in other words, if you are a person that wants to have a life of the mind and a discussion with the world, but you never make anything, is there something, is there an animal inside of you that's an artist anyway, and what is that? It's almost like the spiritual side of the question, but if you have a thought about that, that would be interesting.
Right now? Yes. I am not an artist. I have loved art always, but by the time I got to high school, it was like no technical talent. And I actually was not interested. I was much more interested in like having a crit and being a part of a crit than making the thing. Like I wanted to talk about it, but I didn't really want to make it. And I think, that's part of the equation for sure. Like a commitment to wanting to, be in debate and not always have consensus. And Mira, what you were just saying about proficiency is really sticking in my head, because I think it's almost like you don't want to, it's like, do I want to be proficient enough that there's no kind of discussion about it? I don't know. So maybe it is a critical community that needs to happen for these. Again, I'm thinking about Boston in the 80s, and like that's kind of that scene was so outside of the major institutions like Harvard, MIT, MFA, even ICA, which was much smaller at the time. But there is this kind of like need to be outside and be kind of contending or in conflict with something else. But I'd be curious what everyone else thinks too.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to answering the original question. Helen or Fred, do you want to?
Okay, no, I can just follow up on that. So,
I think you need to.
sorry. So one other thing is regarding proficiency, and that's something that I think, as an educator, I mean, I'm confronted with that all the time, because I see students come in with a certain kind of talent, and the talent is never equally distributed, right? And you can see some students has talent, and some students don't. And by the first week, based on that notion of proficiency, you can probably say, well, those with proficient talent would be a good artist. But I can tell you right now, that's never the case. It's never the case where just because you're good at what you do, and you're good at your craft and everything like that, that you will be a interesting art student or even become an artist. And going back to that is, in the part of, in terms of what Mira said, are you an artist? And I'm always reminded when I took calculus about this fly hitting the windshield, at which point does the fly actually hit the windshield? And I'm always applying that logic to a lot of questions that we ask. And it's, at which point do you become an artist? And many students, they would say, see, I'm an artist. I can paint this, right? And the question is, well, were you an artist before you came to art school? The day before? The hour before? And are you an artist after first year or after second year? And then I apply that to myself. It's like, am I an artist after I graduated from MFA? Or at which point did I become an artist? So it's unlike a doctor where you get a certificate, you can cut somebody open and give them a pill. An artist doesn't quite have that demarcation, right? So one of the things that I tried looking at this, looking back at Hans Hofmann in the time period of 49, and I'm like thinking about in terms of context of society. And one of the things that's very pivotal at the time is that the world was literally changing in a very dramatic way, right? We were going from a dramatic victory over Nazism and authoritarianism into liberalism. And we had some 60 years of liberalism and flourishing of middle class. And as a result of that, we're literally at the tail end of that, what possibly would be, right? So does artists nowadays have any saying or any position in the world which we're in? Unlike 49, where there were a lot of communities of artists. Provincetown actually is a very wonderful place where there's still a lot of artists come together as a community, whether you're writers, whether you're visual artists, or other type of artists you have. But that in itself does not define what an artist is, right? So I thought, okay, how do I go approach this? And I approach this very much the same way I approach in terms of my classes. It's like, I don't have to answer the question. I'll just send out a questionnaire and ask people what they think. And literally, for the past 2 weeks, I've been texting with a lot of artists, friends of mine. Some are very famous. Some, have museum shows and in every collection that you know. And some are just, young artists that didn't think they were artists. And the range are very vast. And the answers can be like as simple as what Kiki Smith says, just be yourself. That's what an artist is. Or to somebody that's a graffiti artist that's been dodging police for the last 30 years because they were just tagging walls. And I asked, so what do you think what an artist? And he's like, I never thought I was an artist until got recognition from the general public. So it's kind of interesting is that, once again, the bug that flies through the windshield, were you an artist the day before you got the recognition or the day after you got the recognition? So what is the definition of artist, right? So in a way that I have a list here of all the from kind of general list of all the artists that they sent back to me, and this afternoon I'm going over and I said, you know what? There's a category of what people think of as different artists. So artists in itself is not just one thing; it's many things. And in today's society, which makes sense because we're not quite as homogenized as we were in 1949, where most of the artists were predominantly white and male. Nowadays, most of my friends, my artist friends, are from every part of the world. So the singular definition of what artist is kind of hard to nail down, right? And one last thing I have to say is that I thought, okay, maybe I'll just consult a dictionary and see what that says. And literally, that doesn't help either, because in the Chinese dictionary, in Chinese term called 艺术家, which means literally someone has talent, someone has creativity, and someone that's person, or like, it's like 3 words that put together. That's what an artist is. It doesn't say the other part of it. And in Oxford Dictionary also says something about someone that just talent and practicing talent and pursuit of that. And in some ways that's part of it, but that doesn't make you an artist, and also it doesn't exclude you as being an artist as well. So.
All right. I feel like the cleanup batter here. I am a writer, so I have written something. So I hope you can hang with a written text. It's not very writerly, so it should be okay. I have to say I found the brief really interesting. I thought it was going to be easy, and then I opened up my laptop and I thought, how did I get to be 58 years old and not know what an artist is? First, it must be said, because we so often forget who we are, that an artist is a human being, which is to say they are a member of a species that lives on planet Earth, which is to say that even though tonight's question is a foundational one, that there is always another layer, always another foundation underneath the foundation. But if we linger on the artist as human part, we can begin to tease out some things. Humans are animals with a highly coordinated set of senses through which they perceive the world. And artists are people who have made an issue of those 5 senses, both individually and their coordination into the arena of human perception. Humans are also the animals on the planet that are most governed by language. My friend, the painter Amy Silmans, calls us the language animal. Our capacity for linguistic invention and our dependency upon the linguistic have done more to articulate us as a species than perhaps any other of our species-specific traits. I say these basic rudimentary things because I think that one way to answer the question of what is an artist is bound up with and tethered to these characteristics of being human. Perhaps the simplest way to say what an artist is to say they are members of the human species who traffic in, and now is a place where you could put a lot of different verbs in the sentence. You could say artists are people who explore, exploit, teach, frolic, manipulate, or traffic in the relations between our perceptual apparatus and our linguistic apparatus. Artists are particularly concerned, I would say that Mira Schor would be case in point number one between the perceptual and the linguistic. Right? Someone who knows exactly what the fog does on the bay in Provincetown, and then puts a word on top of it. So artists are particularly concerned with how these two things, perception and language, conjoin or align to form something we might call knowledge or even truth. The how of this, what tools are used, who pays for this labor, what value is assigned to this work, has changed demonstrably over time. But humans have been doing some version of this activity for millennia. Different cultures have produced different words for the identity of the folks who do this. For those of us who have evolved out of the Western European tradition, the category artist emerges sometime in the mid to late 1400s. And those folks were members of a merchant class, artisans with a trade, that people who were capable of making a kind of image or object that defied or deflected or troubled the things that were typically called useful. This is not to say that centuries worth of people, up to and including myself, didn't or don't find the category of objects we call art not useful. But it is to say that in the West, we have held our art objects apart from most forms of instrumentalized use. And further, since the West loves nothing more than to produce a hierarchy. That's our biggest fucking party trick. Useful objects worked on by artists would come to be valued as lesser than, with names like the decorative or craft. These hierarchies and the ruthless way they have then attached themselves to race and gender meant that over centuries, art came to have a very privileged system of value, largely determined by the class that could afford to possess useless things. For me personally, and I think for culture at large, one truth/fact/reality about art is that part of art's deepest pleasure is in fact its uselessness. Parenthetically, this is probably why artists are anxious, as this can be an existential dilemma leading to therapy on the one hand, and panel discussions on the other. It's good to laugh at oneself. The world would be wretched without art, but it would also proceed. And in its procession, I am of the belief that in my phantasmatic world without artists, humans would once again invent the category art and artists. To paraphrase Brokeback Mountain, even though it's useless, we just can't quit it. So if we return to the problem of what it means to make a useless thing, why should the category of persons who makes useless objects be so special? And special, I do think you all are. I love artists. Anyone who knows me knows I love artists almost as much as I love basketball players. It's not true, I love them more. So why should this category of persons who makes useless objects be so special? That's a question I have been involved in for most of my professional life. For I find art simultaneously useless and an utter necessity. And it is this fundamental contradiction that opens onto one of the many reasons art is so important to me. Art is the category of things that allows me to best think contradiction. Art is what allows me to stay with the difficulty of when opposing ideas are simultaneous and true. This is another way of saying that one of art's roles, and I see role as being slightly different from use, is to both produce and convey knowledge, knowledge of the world, of the self, of perception, of feeling. Many types of people produce knowledge about the world, but it seems to me that one of the most special characteristics of the artist is that the artist exists in a tenuous or tangential, perhaps even contentious relation to organized forms of knowledge production, such as, let's say, science, the academy, the law, medicine. This is not to say that artists don't interact with all of those structures of power and knowledge. Rather, it is to say that artists have the burden of having to define for themselves a set of ethics. There is no Hippocratic oath for artists. There are no scales of justice for artists. There really isn't even peer review for artists. This means that artists must generate the rules of the game they are playing. This is what I hear when I hear artists use the word practice. A practice is a monitoring of self against self. It's the establishment of a set of rules or parameters that govern both process and product. These rules are self-generated, self-imposed, self-obeyed, self-destroyed. In the inimitable words of Bob Dylan, to live outside the law, you must be honest. Or, alternately, to quote the great Omar from The Wire, a man's gots to have a code. Most folks who are not artists find a variety of ways to live ethically, and we are aided greatly by the received social structures of work, family, church, as well as a myriad of other conventional obligations and forms of measurement and value. More simply put, an artist is not obligated to go to their studio every day. No one demands that the poet produce another poem. The ethics of being an artist is, it seems to me, to decide every day that you are one, that you have to be one, and that you and only you can determine what that means. I also think the question, what is an artist, is compounded by the reality that the criteria for judgment about what makes art good or interesting is nothing if not nebulous and contested. One effect of this is that no one can validate the existence of the identity artist except the artist themselves. There is, as Fred has already told us, no bar exam, no governing entity tasked with deciding who is and is not an artist. All of this radical contingency, combined with the magic of making useless things, pushes the person called artist into a position of existential extremity. Basically, the artist has to decide that they are an artist. This, it seems to me, would be hard enough, but then the real difficulty, pleasure, work, and privilege begins. Because then, the person who has decided that they are an artist has to do the work. Material, conceptual, artisanal, and ethical of being one. And that work is one of near constant calibration and infinite questioning. To use this brush or that brush, to work during the day or the night, to write of love or war, to make a picture of the world as one sees it or feels it, to pursue the logic of color, to give way to the morass of the unconscious, to telegraph the future, to pull forward the past, to query the category of gender or science, and so on and so on. An artist must pursue, in other words, their own interests as far and as exhaustively as they are able, without promise of reward or recognition. There's a circularity here. An artist who behaves as an artist will become an artist, and pretty much the only thing they can rely on is the profound knowledge that when they do so, they will join all the others who have done so before them, and with the belief that, if we're lucky, they in turn will be joined by those who call themselves afterwards, after them. Of course, there is another more prosaic way to answer the question, what is an artist? And that is to say, they're the only folks who still get to say no, and they get to wear whatever they want to the gala.
Fantastic. So next, I want to just first ask if any of the panelists have a question for any of the other panelists based on what we just talked about and listened to. Anybody?
Did you reconsider and think that the woman, it's for you, Mira, did you reconsider? Did you ever reconsider and think that the person who had made all those things around her house was an artist?
I asked myself that when I was writing this, and thinking back on that moment, and I'm kind of torn because in a way I think I'd still say the same thing.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I was discounting, let's say, the effect of all the beauty that she created around her, and as I said, that it actually influenced me. But she did not participate in the work, fully in the work that you're describing in your piece. The commitment that it takes to make that step between doing something beautiful just because it just oozes out of you and living through the tough times and the changes and just the investment of being an artist in the world.
Anybody else? So it might be then time for a question about Provincetown. Just because the original panel was in Provincetown and kind of known, or we think of it that way. And, I love this notion that I was talking to Mira the other day because part of the package that we shared to get ready for this included an article that she had written a number of years ago about sort of being, I don't know about willingly or unwillingly, but the inheritor of history and being bodied with the task of, sort of understanding history and legacy and walking around with that knowledge. And I think we also all share that in this room. And, it made me think a little bit about the experience of, sort of being bodied and also Provincetown and the differences between Provincetown then and Provincetown now. I often in the gallery, when people ask about art in Provincetown, I say that with some exception, there's little conceptual art that is made in Provincetown or produced or seen in Provincetown, and in some cases, there's, and with some exception, there's not a lot of performance art, for example. So it sort of has a certain way with itself. And one of the things I say is that a lot of the artists in Provincetown make material responses to elemental circumstances and leave some evidence, some trace of them or their experience in the resulting object or circumstance, sort of a bodied experience as well, And so I'm thinking about that a little bit in response to what people have said, but I also am interested in the difference between Provincetown then and now, and if anybody on the panel has thoughts about that. Certainly there are big changes in the way people can come here and live and make art. What it costs to be here and the spaces themselves, the size of the spaces have really changed what people can produce. In my experience, and there are, of course, anytime you make a rule, it's broken, so I'm not saying these are rules, but there are wonderful exceptions to this. But I see the institutions right now as being major contributors to bringing new people with new ideas into Provincetown itself, rather than a studio system or a summer that you can work at a restaurant and make enough money to pay your next semester's tuition or something like that. So that's a sort of a flip side compared to what we know about what was going on around the time of the first panel, for example. So any thoughts about Provincetown itself? Any thoughts about art making in Provincetown? Just any ideas at all? There's no sort of specific outcome of the question, but I think it's relevant to think about Provincetown for a minute on the panel.
Can I answer that?
Sure. Yeah.
So as you were talking, I'm kind of very much mindful of the fact that, in 1949, when those artists came, they were kind of escaping something, right? They were trying to go somewhere that's in its purest form of creating a community literally out of nothing, and then there is no expectation of something in terms of what the environment already has embedded within it. With some 50, 60 years later, Provincetown has a rich history. Regardless what you want to do as an artist, you have to contend with that history. Whereas those artists came before them, their contention with history tend to be dialogues, and this is kind of goes back to Mira's issue with that artist or that person. Right? Is that at the very fundamental nature, what a lot of artists do, I don't say everybody, but what a lot of artists do, is that they have dialogue with the past, right? There's a kind of a communication with the artists and with the history that came before them. And there's a critical dialogue between that and the contemporary time. And when they came together in 1949, it was such a critical moment where American art was just about to explode internationally. And right now, if you think about it in terms of a society, we're once again in the middle of the dialogue of international politics. We're at a pivotal moment where are we going to reverse the 70 years of liberalism towards something different? And the second question is, those people who call themselves artists, what are their roles in terms of playing within that? And Provincetown, as a community, is there a place in Provincetown where artists can come together and form a kind of community that reflects up on that kind of challenge?
Except I don't think that it is that place anymore. And I want to go backward in time to the summer of, I think it's 1916, when the summer of the Provincetown Players and Eugene O'Neill living in Garbage Gables, which is now this, fairly old condo, fancied up. I think Provincetown had been an art community, had art people coming to draw from nature, and they were teachers, and that was already set up by that time. But in general, that summer was important because American artists, writers could not go to Europe because it was in the middle of World War I. So they came and actually lived here, some people year-round for a year or so, among them Eugene O'Neill, and Mary Heaton Vorse was an important figure in that time. The house is wonderfully preserved. And so it was an open space. It was like a pirate space. In fact, Mary Heaton Vorse's son was on a panel many years ago here at the Art Association, and he talked about a story that went around when he was a kid. So we're talking back to exactly that time period at around 1916. And so the story is that a man sells his soul to the devil, and 7 years later or whatever, the devil comes to get his due, and the guy just starts running, and he runs up the Cape. He runs from Wellfleet to Truro, and the devil is right behind, and then he's like running, and he runs to Truro, finally gets to Provincetown, and he says, okay, I'm sorry, I can't run anymore, take me to hell. And the devil says, you're already there. Because it was a kind of a pirate town. Yeah. It was a fishing town. It was a rough space. But that rough space was an open space. That open space continued to exist in some form into the 50s, and I think, and then it did continue a little longer. But I think now the real estate issues here are such that it is, no young artist can come here unless they pay to participate in a week at the work center, or they get a residency at the work center. And we've just been talking today about what the changing demographic is of the people who even want to be fellows at in a place like Provincetown. What their world goals are and what their expectations are, as opposed to, let's say, a similar artist 40 years ago, for example. So I think there are a lot of young artists who would crave going to someplace so beautiful and be able to be free and maybe do some theater and do all the things that the people did that summer of 1916, write plays and put them up on a pier next to the fish, you know, I mean, literally. It's very sad. I mean, I feel like in a state of mourning in a way about, you know, I've lived, for one thing, I was thinking the other day that I first came here 68 years ago. I was 7 years old. And if I thought back to 1916, I've actually witnessed more than half of the history of that modern history of Provincetown as an art scene. And when I walk, I have a, you know, when I take a walk every day, and I want to walk along the beach, I have a double vision, because the double vision is that you know, well, there's that nice house, and I think that used to be blah, blah, blah. That used to be so-and-so's studio. And there's some things I don't remember that well because I was a child. I know Milton Avery lived down the block from where we were renting. You know, and just that my parents, who were artists, could rent for the entire summer and be completely surrounded by artists living in almost every house for, you know, several blocks, you know, especially in this end of town. That none of that is possible. It would be very desirable.
Yeah.
And yet it's, so you can only import, you know, artists in a kind of little package, you know, if they get a residency or something.
But Mira, can I ask you a question? So, is that absolutely true? But and I'm just thinking in terms of, like, you were in New York for a long time, right? And you were with the wave of artists that can actually sustain a career in New York for very little money. Right.
Still, yes,
Yeah,
I was.
right.
Yeah.
And I was on the latter end of that. You can live.
Yeah, so New York has the same problem.
That's right.
Yeah.
So there's
The whole world has
exactly.
has the same problem.
And then
Yeah.
when I
Yeah.
moved to Boston, I was like, you know, I was able to live very cheaply for a while, and then the market kind of just
Yeah,
took
no,
over.
it is.
So it's not.
It
you
is
know,
an issue
Like,
that
where
is
can
global.
artists to go that
Yeah.
becomes that develop like a community without.
So the flip side of that question is sort of what I was hinting at when I used the word proficiency.
Right.
Is that you get artists young artists and more, who are much better businessmen than my parents' generation, even though there were people who were ambitious, and there was, you know, somebody in the family, usually the wife of the artist, that would be taking care of that side of things and making sure that, you know, cards went out and mailing lists were kept and everything. But I think that I think that of necessity of what you're pointing out, you end up with an influence of that real estate market, basically, on the art that's produced, as well as the collector base. Because Provincetown, let's say in the 50s and early and 60s, there were a lot more galleries, and they seemed more organic up to the moment. And I think people did, you know, there was a kind of give and take financially or parity. There were rich people, but they weren't that rich comparatively, you know, seriously. And they enjoyed being with artists. I'm not so sure how that mixes now.
You know, I think in my lifetime here, there's been a moment where Provincetown became a much less separate place, and where it began to be willing to and forced to share shared concerns about currency and value and communication and transportation, and you know, I feel sad for that loss of, you know, the ability for a separate place to develop its own eccentricities and sort of endorse them and let them flourish, you know. But I'll give you, we should probably open this up to questions, but I'll give you an example too of how, and this is not a positive example in response, it's an example of something that is part of what you're talking about. In the crash in 2007, 2008, 2006, 7. So this is a gallery story. I was co-broking a piece of art with a dealer from a very big, formidable gallery in New York. And what I had done is sold the piece of art that was on the catalog that he was about to issue for the show. And he hated me, and he was really clear about that. He was a really big, powerful dude, and he was not happy that I was in his life in any way, shape, or form. And so, but in July of that year, I talked to him on the phone, and everybody was having a meltdown. I'm sure everybody here remembers it. It was quite a time, and nobody knew what was going on, and so everybody was asking each other, "Well, how you doing? How you doing? What's going on? What's going on?" And he said, "Well, how you doing? What's going on?" And I said, I don't really know. It's the beginning of the season here. We're just starting up, and it's very different, and everybody's really anxious. And this guy, who was a real power player, started to cry on the phone. He just broke, and he said, "You do not know how lucky you are in Provincetown to be apart, to be a little bit separate." He said, "We are married to the stock market here. Nobody knows what's going to happen until October. We don't know if you're even going to be in our spaces. You have a loyal community of visitors that come with a little money in their hand that are interested in looking what people make there." And I thought, oh, I've never forgotten that, ever. But it's a story that's buoyed up on currency and value, not on making things that don't have a function. So I think that is part of where we're at right now. So, anybody else on the panel? Because I want to maybe see if people have
I
questions.
just wanted to point out, just if we're looking back to the past, I think the notion of art schools was very crucial to that sort of period, post-war, actually pre-war period too, that people came to study with artists here. And the point is they could afford to do that. And that's one of the things that's a way to bring young people into a community that then form a loyalty to that community. And that's one of the things that's not present in the way that would make it
really
continue.
Would anyone here in the audience like to ask a question tonight? Anybody? If it's appropriate, could you ask the panelists that you'd like to have answer the question first?
Ask one member of the panel.
If you'd like, if it's for a person, let us know who it is. Okay.
I don't.
Okay. Then general. That's great.
Sort of a general question.
Perfect.
Anyone can answer it, or you all can chime in. But my question is that, based on this discussion, I'm left with the impression that there's a boundary. Let me explain what my thinking is. That the concept of what an artist is lives on one side of the boundary, and everything else is on the other side of the boundary. Now, you can tell me whether my thinking is correct or incorrect, but just let's assume it is correct. It raises the question in my mind, where is that boundary? We said during the discussion that, for example, an artist wants to display to the world a concept that artist has. We also said that scientists, for example, might not be artists. So, once again, that raises this question about a boundary. Is that so? Does that make any sense?
Yes, I think it is so, but none of us really want to talk about it, admit it, or get into any kind of geographical discussion about where the boundary is. It's real. No, I mean, I think the force of the question, what is an artist, is that the reason none of us know the answer is because we all secretly know exactly the answer. And that's what's so brilliant about Mira's story about her friend, is that she knew that chick is not an artist. And we all laughed, not because it was mean, but because we too have had that internal moment of taste where we're like, I don't know what you call that, but I'm not going to call it art. And that's really, that's actually quite profound. The ineffable inarticulateness around that which is somehow unknowable, but that we actually feel in many ways that we know. It's partly why we're accused of being elitist, which we are, being snobs, which we are, being, whores of taste, which we are, right? Like, none of these things we want to take on, I don't think, in a serious way, because it's too vulnerable making. And yet, there is something about, and I think everyone talked about it, where every artist who makes something is making something out of a profoundly long tradition that they have no choice but to be engaged in. And that becomes partly where the boundary is. Like, are you or are you not doing the great work of pulling history, which means pulling others, and the voices of those who have been heard and have not been heard forward with you when you do your work?
Just another, I agree with you. I agree with what you say. I think also for me, I grew up, my parents were artists, and I began to make work very early. And now I actually feel that I began to make my first work, significant work, when I was 10. But that period, until I, there was a certain point where I had to decide what I was going to do with my life. You go through high school, you're the creative one, you're the artistic one, and then you go to college, and then, okay, now what are you going to do? And I had the option to become an art historian because that was my undergraduate studies. I was very interested in it. But I didn't see, first of all, I didn't see a path where I could make my mark. It was just before the invention of feminist art history, basically. And I mean, really significantly, because Lyndon Auckland's essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, was published in 1970, and that was the year where I was beginning to think, okay, I'm about to graduate. What am I going to do? I was graduating from college. But what I'm trying to say is I had to make a decision that as an adult, I was going to be an that I was going to take the talent that I'd had and even the practice that I actually had, because I worked very similarly, let's say, to the way I do now in series and so forth. But I had to decide that that's what I was going to do, and that also meant taking risks and choosing a life, that I knew some of the issues of being the child of art, of artists. But then nevertheless, when you have to do it for yourself, it's a big decision to make and a risky one, So I made the decision, and I think that that's, one of those borderlines.
Yeah, there's another way of looking at it, is that the way I view it is that throughout history, some of the greatest artists, they all know where the boundary is, and they try to break the boundary. Mm-hmm. That's what makes some of the artists great, because they can sense where the boundary is, and they want to cross it over. So that if you don't know where the boundary is, you're just forever lost in the mires of making things. And I think in some ways, that's what probably troubled you about your friend, is that there isn't a boundary. You're just making things.
Yes,
right?
yes.
So to have a boundary, and I think I'm reminded of the Supreme Court decision on pornography, is that you know once you see it, right? So I think what makes a good artist is that a good artist really sense where that boundary is, and they're always trying to challenge that, and that's what push it ahead. And if you look at when you go to museums, it's evident on the wall that from one artist to another artist that they kind of broke the boundaries. And all the way from Renaissance onwards, you'll see the reason they're there, because they brought something to the table, they know where the boundary is, and they crossed over, and they were better for it.
Thanks. I think we're pretty done, or we could do
No,
one
we
more
have some
quick
more
question.
questions.
One more, yeah.
We need more questions.
Thank you all so much. This is really inspiring. think this is half question and half observation, and it does have to do with the boundary idea, but it's really coming from what Helen was saying in her whole description of the idea of that kind of inner challenging and the idea of project, all those things. The Adam Moss book, The Work of Art, I've been kind of reading my way through that, and I'm not systematically. I'm a poet, so I'm looking at the poets first. But what's interesting about that book is the breadth of the people. If you don't know this book, he interviews 40 different artists, and they go across this huge span. There are poets, there are playwrights, but there are also people who do crossword puzzles, and there are drag queens, and there are cartoonists. But in each case, what really happens is he's getting them to go back to what did you write in your notebook? Where did this start? What did you throw away? And again, it's about persistence and the fact that it's not the proficiency. And it's about staying the curiosity, the kind of almost insane persistence with something, drawing from all directions. It's also about like how time doesn't work the same way for someone doing this than it does for somebody who has other kinds of work. And in that sense, it's kind of a fascinating study that actually illustrates so much of what you were saying. I just wanted to offer that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think for me, that's the ethics part. Like to me, sometimes I'm not, a chef can be an artist, Mira can be an artist, Fred can be an artist. But to me, it's really about the ethics of how, did you, again, it's always a basketball metaphor for me. Michael Jordan notoriously, Kobe Bryant notoriously showed up before practice and stayed after practice. That's kind of what I'm talking about. That drive, that determination, that commitment, actually to yourself, but to not only yourself in an egotistical way, to yourself as the embodiment of something. That's how you could cross border. That's how those people did, in fact, break certain borders, right? Like that you don't commit to yourself just, it's not like living your best life or some like wellness trip. It's like you commit to an idea because you understand, I think if you're an artist, that you are actually adding to this huge stream of knowledge that is thousands of years old.
What I think, Michael Jordan showing up early and staying late is also a love of the game, a love of process,
Right.
and that's also, I think, part of any commitment that you make, any choice that you make in life for what you're going to do. There's some people who do it, and there are other people who really love it, and that's one of the differences, perhaps. Also, there was a question on that side of there. Yeah.
So the question, what is an artist, is sort of a status question. And what I hear a lot of you saying actually is much more about the thing that's more interesting to me is how do you make an experience of art? How do you have the art experience? Which, that means the art is in the world, the art talks to a community or an audience. And so I just wonder if you're willing to flip the question and say, what is an art experience? Rather than just addressing the status question of who's an artist.
I mean, I think this goes back to like the question around boundaries, and I think I'm thinking about John Dewey here, because my first kind of response to the question around boundaries is thinking about Forum 49 and how interdisciplinary it was, and how many different thinkers were at the table. And my first thought was like, well, there's no more boundaries. We need to kind of break through all of that. But then, of course, I do agree with you, Helen. There is a boundary, and we all know where it is. But I think, and the same goes for experience. Like, I'm thinking about John Dewey, and like, there's these transformative experiences that happen. And I think again, not to be kind of spiritual or, very touchy-feely about it, but we all know when we see something that is transformative that stops us in our tracks, or we hear something, or we see a line of words that are put together in a sentence, and it's like imprinted in us. And I think as a curator, I'm more and more interested, and have been for a while, of making experiences for people, and not in kind of like a here's your Instagram selfie moment type of way, but what are the ingredients to make something that is a really transformative space, that it is beyond the hierarchy of the white cube, but it is also not patronizing to people in any way. So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
There's an image that for some reason is staying in my mind, so I'll just share it, because in a way it puts a little bit in question everything I've said tonight, but which is I was doing like a little visiting artist. I was on a panel in art school in Vancouver, but it gave me the opportunity to go to I think it was a university museum of British Columbia, and they had these study drawers, where you just could pull open. And this is already maybe 20 years ago, and I'm just, as we've been talking, I keep on having this image of opening a drawer, and there was this slipper, like a made out of, deer hide or something, beautifully embroidered, but it was very, very old. I don't remember how many years, but it was really, really old. And just thinking, the minute human beings started to go like, I think I can put like this next to this. It looks really nice. It doesn't really help me survive, but it food-wise, but it actually is really neat. So the minute human beings had like 2 minutes not to find meat, they started to do things. And in that sense, the definition of art or who is an artist can become broader, but we're speaking at the end of a very long process of evolution and of specialization. So that's, I think, where this discussion has taken place, and not so much in, whereas my friend, who I was telling, her, you're not an artist, was a person like the person who had sewed this beautiful thing. Everything she touched was beautiful, So that's another way of being an artist at the beginning of humanity.
Well, I've just gotten an important message from the DNC. So, it's 7:30. I want to thank all of you for